Hello and welcome to the official podcast of PalateXposure, featuring Ilona Thompson, a podcast for those seeking the ultimate in wine, food, and travel. Each week she interviews winemakers, chefs, celebrities, and a variety of guests that shape the way we enjoy life.
I'm Ilona Thompson, PalateXposure, coming to you from Pebble Beach, here with John Tesar, a chef that I've watched on television a whole lot, season 10 and 14. At Top Chef, but really is a personality that has made such a huge impact on our food culture. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City,
Okay.
and my parents had a house in the Hamptons. But they weren't wealthy people. My father walked beach patrol in Montauk during World War II, and while he was doing that, my mother learned how to cook from Italian women.
Wow.
So we had the bay in the backyard and the ocean in the front yard, and Manhattan 10, 12 months out of the year, and we would go out to the beach every weekend, all year round. So now the Hamptons is more of an all year round kind of experience, but back then we did it all the time. Right. And when my dad was in the military, he made friends with all of the commercial fishermen and lobster guys. So like on Friday night at our house, it was like a hotel. My mother really introduced me to the romance of what food and socializing can really bring to your soul.
Wow. So you were surrounded by it and you absorbed it.
It absorbed it, and just the smells, and I guess I was born with a palate, and I'm a simpleton in the sense that I've learned after all these years, and working in France, working in New York, replacing Dean Ferring. I've had a lot of great moments.
Yeah.
I'm living one of my greatest moments now, just as an older chef, doing more restaurants and stuff like that. But it's all about like focus and keeping it simple. And I think if you look at some of the greatest food in the world, it really is just very simple, especially seafood. Because before I got into the steak thing in Texas and knife, and which is knock wood, it's the most incredible thing that's ever happened to my career. But I applied the same mentality that I did to French food, to seafood, to any food, is just finding a great ingredient, treating it with respect, and then being clever with it. I think that's a pretty easy formula to follow if you're a chef.
So what got you cooking formally? Like, how did you transition from just experiencing it and getting into it?
I was a surfer and a skateboarder in that beach town, and I figured out a way to hang out at the beach all day long and then make a living at night because my dad wanted me to. He was old school. Nice. I had to go get a job,
Yeah.
So I fell in with this really, fast, hip, young crowd. I fell in with this fast, young, and hip crowd. You can edit that out, probably.
Yeah.
And then we worked at this little pub in West Hampton Beach called Magic's.
Okay.
And it was amazing because every day I made Bloody Mary mix. I washed dishes by hand. But on the other side of the bar was George Plimpton, Jimmy Breslin, Jackson Pollock, and all these people in the Hamptons in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was just a child. I grew up in an Irish pub. And there was no American cuisine back then, per se. There was all of these things that existed, like Mama Leone's was in New York, or Luchow's, or the Rainbow Room. We grew up in New York and my dad would take us to those restaurants.
It's fascinating that you were surrounded by this culture, and it had to have influenced you as you moved along.
I think subliminally it really did influence me. And then I just had a passion for it because it was like part of it reminded me, it was the good parts of home.
Yeah.
Like the really important parts. Like we would, like in the house in the Hamptons, we didn't have a huge house, but on Saturday morning I would wake up and my mom would have like 12 people at the table. And when I got older, she would have them, they would have their revivals and come back out for one big weekend on 4th of July or Labor Day or Memorial Day or something. And I'd have to come over and make Eggs Benedict for all the women in the morning. I'd come back to the house, Mom, and my mom had like a little electric stove in this little beach house. And I'm making hollandaise sauce, and all the women were like, "Oh my God!" It was kind of a weird.
Good eggs.
Yes.
That's really a test.
I still work brunch to this day, every once in a while, because I think it's one of the most fun meals to make.
Really,
it's quick and it's fast and people really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, I think it's just like such a pleasurable pastime.
Yeah.
Just being able to enjoy a Sunday afternoon properly.
And it happens everywhere, but especially in Texas, because there's not a lot to do on Sunday other than shop and eat. So brunch in Dallas is a pretty big thing. People go to church, and then when they get out of church, they go to brunch. You know, so it's I did it in New York all the time. When I worked at 44 and 10 Hell's Kitchen, when I built that restaurant on 44th Street and 10th Avenue, I did brunch every Sunday because I just enjoyed it. You know, and it is those things technically, like how to poach an egg, hollandaise sauce, how to make a good French toast, and then we expanded it to like chicken and waffles and all these kind of other things. And they're very technical but very simple American food. And I think that's all I've cooked my whole life. Even when I was in France, or I learned that from French chefs. Or if you go to Le Bernardin, I mean, it's beautiful. The service is amazing, but it really just is a fish on a plate, and then they come and pour some amazing sauce around it. So you learn how to let the protein or whatever that item is be the star of the show, and not let it even be about you. It's like you're giving to it, and it gives back to you through the guest. You know, and I feel those things. I've always felt them as a chef. You know.
So you became conscious of your chefy, personality, that love, that connection very early on, it sounds like.
Oh, I did 17, 18 years old. I was the chef de cuisine of a really notable French restaurant in the Hamptons called Club Pierre.
Wow.
It was owned by Francine Farkas, whose husband owned Alexander's and a large part of Lexington Avenue. Mm-hmm. And his daughter, Georgette, was Danielle Boulud's assistant for over 30 years, and now has her own little boîte bistro in New York that Danielle helped her open.
Yeah.
So it was like weird. It's like, I think this business, it's always been 6 degrees of separation for kind of everybody.
Yeah.
Especially when you grew up in New York. All of us were like, I'm old enough, but I was in that generation, but I didn't work in Manhattan until I was older. But if you look, all my friends worked for Alfred Portali, and now, just like the new younger generation used to work for Tom Colicchio, and now they're, they, like the chefs come out of one kitchen, and then you see 5, 6, 7 years go by, and then they become real chefs of their own world, and then they spawn the next generation of really amazing chefs in New York. And that's always the way it was, and that's kind of, we're losing that a little bit. The ability to really work as an apprentice, like you would in France or in Italy or anywhere in Europe. That you pay your dues, you learn your respect, and then then you start to, as you get better. What I miss from my kitchens and a lot of these kids today, nobody challenges me in the kitchen. They go about their work and they do it well, but they don't. In New York, when we were younger, we had this all the time. Like, you had to hold a position in the kitchen in New York. You had to be competitive.
Yeah,
you had to keep. You had to. It was like being on a team. You had to pay your dues.
No, I mean, who were some of your most seminal influencers, like throughout your career, early on, and then?
Well, my mom definitely was the number one influencer, and then as I got older, I've always been like an insider outsider, and I say that because I didn't care. I didn't know what reviews were. I didn't really know the business side of the restaurant or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So I really have just been doing it for the love of the actual physicality of the cooking, and being clever, and learning how to do something. And I think when I was coming up, you were allowed to make mistakes because food wasn't as good as it is now on the whole. Mm-hmm. So we kind of reached the zenith with that, and I think now we're unfortunately, we're sliding back down the other way because a lot of young kids are just dispensing with foundation. Mm-hmm. And I'm not, God bless them, but without foundation, without Escoffier, without all of these, like historical things that have really built the foundation of cooking, not of famous cooking, of cooking. And I think people have confused the two as well. Like they don't know, we're chefs, we should cook for a living, and it's hospitality, you serve people. We've turned it into chefs are famous, and now people should give us something or pay attention to us or fawn over us, when I think it should be, in reality, the other way around. So if you have that, if you're able to capture that kind of audience and have that kind of privilege, it should make you an even better chef. You shouldn't leave your kitchen, you shouldn't be doing, a million things. I mean, you could have multiple restaurants, or you could have different concepts, but you have to work. The minute you stop cooking, you're no longer a chef.
The minute you stop cooking, you're no longer a chef. How about that? I mean, there's so much this kind of a rock star mentality, it's really assumed consent from what I've been seeing around.
Yeah, and it's becoming, it's been this way for a good 10 years now,
Yeah.
I mean, even at my age, not forced, but I forced myself to do Top Chef because I wanted to maintain my relevancy. I didn't want to be old school or and I hate this new, I had a conversation with somebody the other day about awards and doing things, and people say, haven't you aged out of that yet? And I'm like, aged out? Like, what does that mean, aged out? I'm going to cook until I die. Like age should have nothing to do with anything in life.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the downsides of American culture is that we put this cap on age.
Yes.
And then we've taught this generation this cap on age, and now they're going to throw it back at us.
It's
like
really
you're old,
sad. Yeah. I think European cultures are naturally wedded that old is wise. We tend to think as old, and that's truly unfortunate because you lose so much value. So
you lose the truth.
Yes. There's obviously a lot of love for television series like Top Chef, and I know, and actually discovered you through Top Chef. Do you think that they actually have done a good job in portraying the modern culture of?
Yes and no. And I have a lot of respect for the show and its producers and Magical Elves and the whole crew and everything. We're like family. And you see even by being here in Pebble Beach how many of this season 14 cast still stays together. Like the girls are in Coachella. If you follow them on Instagram, Casey, Shirley, and Brooke are at Coachella, and BJ and Sheldon, myself in here, and Joe Sato. And there's something about like season 14, because we were the returning guests, and there had been a number of years since like a real All-Stars, which like Richard Blaze had won, and that was like the first time thing, and it kind of respawned his career or whatever it was. So people, I think, related to the 8 of us more than a lot of other people who had done Top Chef, because we had done it again in a different way against new people.
Yeah.
And it didn't mean that you were automatically going to win. I didn't think it was very fair, because there's a lot of psychological advantage, and also understanding, like being an entertainer, being on the set, learning how it is, and working with directors and knowing what the competition is really about and how they're going to capture you. And I think when you do that for the first time, and season 14 for me was a nightmare, because I thought I was just going to go cook.
Yeah.
And it was 22 people in an apartment in Seattle, Washington. And, I think early on, because I had a pedigree, because I was older, because I was outspoken, and I did talk about my friends and chefs, it turned everybody against me.
Yeah.
Because, like when you're on a reality TV show, if people think you're going to win.
Yeah.
But then on season 14, I learned even if I cooked the best food ever, there was no way I was going to beat Sheldon or Brooke, because the audience has a large part to define who really is the next top chef. And I think that's a good thing, because you have to be marketable. You have to have a region or a restaurant or businesses for them to continue that marketing. And don't kid yourself, that's that way with anything. Whether it be James Beard or a list or your local food critic, somebody's doing something because they have an agenda, an end result. And that's where I think we lose a little bit, because it's not so much, it's become more about you and the entertainment and not so much about the food. And I'm not saying everybody, but I think on a larger, on a broader plane, people think they can slip in through notoriety as opposed to actually cooking their way into it.
So going back to the food roots, you've been regarded by lots of people over the years that recognize just your raw, incredible talent. You can cook anybody onto the table.
I don't look at it that way. It's just, for me, it's survival, because it's all I've ever had. So when you ask me to cook, I'm cooking for my life every time I do it. And it's not about winning. It's about, this is what I do, and I can't disappoint, because if I do, then then I'm disappointing myself as well. It's a little neurotic, I guess, but it's it's what motivates me. And like for Bourdain, it's so weird, because I knew Tony for so long before he was so famous. And I know now that he's killed himself and no longer with us, it's kind of, everyone has kind of related to it and knows who he is, and it's very sad. It's not kind of sad, it's very sad. But for him to become such a brand and so popular and know everybody in the universe, and to say the things that he said about me is really an amazing throwback to our friendship, even though we bickered and had all these little magazine fights. And when he married, I think Octavia, he just became a little bit of a different person. He backed away from a lot of people because she was very domineering, so to speak, and he liked that.
Yeah.
And I'm not the only one to think that. I know people, I did a little blurb for his autobiography recently, and his writing partner was the person that interviewed me for that, and a lot of people saw that kind of like him taking a little bit of a step back and then becoming famous, and and becoming a little different, and God bless him. I mean, he really was talented. I think he was an amazing writer, and I think more of an orator. I mean, that voiceover on that show really made the show. He redefined TV, food TV in a certain way, and he combined it with world travel, politics, social issues, extremism, and just going over and breaking bread and talking to people he had never met before.
He certainly has, and he didn't mince words. And you're right, for him to identify you as the cook, I mean, he really spoke very poignantly. There's a quote that used quite frequently about you, just how good you are, that nobody can cook like you. I think it's great to get compliments, and it's great to be talented. But as the practitioner, you need to take yourself out of that equation and not look at it that way. You kind of just have to be yourself, because otherwise you have a miserable life. To just be on all the time or to think so highly of yourself, I think is a little self-destructive in the big picture, because that kind of odor is going to emit to other people, and it's not a good way to live, And I've been in that. The complex thing is that people say these nice things about me, but I've never felt them about myself. Yeah.
So it's kind of, that's what therapy's for, I guess. But but I've worked my way through that. But in that, we're all kind of in the same boat together. If you come to my restaurant and you're happy with it, I'm having a good day. I stopped looking at what other people do, because it's a distraction. It takes away from what I need to do for my restaurant, for my staff, for my guests. Mm-hmm. And when you're insecure early on and you want to be somebody, it's like it's a struggle.
Of course it is, and so many people can relate to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all struggling, and some of us are more willing to admit it than others, and some have to do it publicly, which is not easy.
Yeah, for me, it's cathartic, and I think sometimes I used to think it was embarrassing having to do it, and some people thought it was desperate or whatever, but it's just who I am, and I don't think that people give me enough credit for just being who I am. They have opinions of me from television or from other people's comments about me, good and bad.
Yeah.
Right? But when people actually take the time to get to know me and spend time with me and cook with me or travel with me, you see all my buddies, we're tighter as, we're like thick as thieves, all of us from Top Chef. And, I mean, there's some people who are very lofty and into themselves and famous from that show, and they carry themselves differently, but you can see that in them, and I don't begrudge them that. It's just not my style. I mean, I like when people notice that we were on Top Chef, or they say, I ate in your, I'm happier when they say, I ate in your restaurant. Like when I'm in Pebble Beach and we're outside having a glass of wine, watching the sunset, and they come up to you and they go like, I ate in your restaurant and I had a really, really good time. Or last night I did the steak event. We brought some amazing steak, and people were like, this is the best steak I've ever had in my life. Or they came down and said, I'm coming to Dallas, I'm going to eat in your restaurant, or I've eaten at your restaurant in Dallas. That to me is more important than any award or star or, critical opinion, because they're the one paying the bill.
Yeah.
Critics don't pay the bill.
No.
For the most part, food television doesn't pay the bill, even for the people, except if you're at the super top of it. Because we've all done enough food television to know it's like, season 1, $5,000 an episode, you give 20 or 25% to an agent, you give 50% to taxes, and you're doing it just to be out there on television, Mm-hmm. And I've done all those shows, Beat Bobby Flay, I wouldn't do Cutthroat Kitchen or Chopped, I'm sorry, I'm not being a snob, it's just I thought my career was beyond that kind of competitive show.
Yeah.
And I really respect the way Top Chef does it, because they really have, I think Tom is just an amazing chef and a practitioner. He keeps that show, focused. To the best of his ability, he tries to give people the ingredients, the time, the opportunity to show what they really can do. Where a lot of other places, it's about humiliating yourself, or you make something totally grotesque because they gave it, beef jerky and whipped cream or something like that. And you can do something with it, but it's not something everyone's going to want to eat. It's just, how clever can you be? And that to me is like what you're saying. Like, people think I'm an amazing chef or I have talent. It's like, for me, it's common sense. But because I was taught by people who study culinary history, and I can't stress this enough. I've been teaching kids in schools, some underprivileged neighborhoods. I hate to use that, because you live where you live, and your opportunity is your opportunity. And these kids just want to cook, and they want to get into business. And there are a couple of high schools, even public schools in Dallas, that are developing culinary programs with full kitchens and dining rooms that are similar to culinary schools. And I was impressed by that whole thing, and it's part of the high school curriculum. So they're not paying $90,000 a year to learn how to make hollandaise sauce and then try to work in a restaurant and be basically get in the way.
Yeah.
You know?
What happened to our culture that we got so far away from the foundational stuff that we're no longer really?
This is where I'm going to sound really OG, and I'm on Instagram, and I don't do so much Facebook anymore, but because I'm mad at Mark Zuckerberg for the privacy issues and stuff like that, and people do creep on your stuff, and just they surmise the wrong things by watching you on social media, and I think it's if you look at the politics, what happened in the 2016 election, and how they use social media to influence people, or the big orange idiot, he uses the word fake news all the time. There is a lot of fake news out there. That's where he's able to take advantage of that, because social media is not regulated. It's easy to be fraudulent. And if you have any kind of like video or contemporary talent to, or you know how to do those types of things, visual things, you'll become a phenomenon just from that, even without real content. So I think that this generation that's coming up now, they're living a different electronic, very fast-paced life. And they're trying to keep up, and they don't even know why they're trying to keep up or what they're keeping up with. So I've at my age, I've been backed into that corner many times. And when you're backed into a corner, you start creating things for survival, to help yourself, to figure out how to have a place in the world. It's like either you do that or you give up, or you just kind of walk a simple path in life.
Yeah.
But if push to shove, if you're talented and backed into a corner, you're going to try to use your talent or your survival skills to get out of that corner.
Yeah.
And that's what these kids are doing. They're just trying to find their identity. And I think it comes down to their parents not really being honest with them.
Yeah.
Like you're seeing this college scandal now. There's people people have been donating money to colleges for years and years and years.
Yeah.
To get their kids in school. But this is now where just like it's so raw.
Yeah.
That they're just paying some guy in the mob to bribe a coach. I mean, it's like crazy town. That people would even think that this is okay.
And picking victims and
yeah.
It really is about that. It's about selling the news. It's not about the real story anymore. And I really wish that food world would not be tainted with any of it, but that's wishful thinking.
Those days are long gone.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have survived a few generations of this world we live in, the culinary world I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I have a good perspective, and it's a hopeful, joyful perspective, but there are corrections that are necessary. And I think fame is not necessarily good for food.
That's really interesting.
Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't mean that people shouldn't be notable or famous or recognized for being talented in this business, because food is such a very important part of our lives.
Yeah.
But you can't put the cart before the horse. And for years now, kids have just right out of school, they want to go.
They want to be a rock star.
They want to be a rock star.
Yeah.
You can't, even rock stars played in shitty bars and learned how to get on the road and do certain things. You can't do it in a day or a year or 2 years.
No, it's such an important message, and somebody like you who's been through the school of hard knocks, and even as famous and recognized as you are, it was a very long, arduous journey, and you took some detours and you took some beatings that, arguably were fair or unfair, depending on the perspective, but you certainly had to deal with that.
And the beatings, I think they're better than the compliments.
Really?
Because you learn, they're the moments where you really have to have self-reflection.
Yeah.
And there's not enough self-reflection in our business. It's all adulation.
Yeah.
Or you get pushed aside. There's no middle ground anywhere in America anymore. It's like either you're haves or have-nots.
Yeah.
So,
that's true.
And now we're drawing a line down the middle where it's like, how do you get on, you definitely don't want to be a have-not. So how do you become a have? And you do it through being clever or with desperation or reinventing something that you think you're reinventing.
Yeah.
And then because the people around you have noticed that you're getting noticed, it's like the emperor's new clothes. They start telling you how good you are,
Yeah.
and then you lose perspective and focus of what good really is.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem with our business right now, is that people don't really know what good is anymore. And that's partially the reason why I fought with some critics, or I spar with some guys like Bill Addison and Pete Wells. I'll do it very quietly, privately. But I talk to them because I respect the two of them, and I think they have a sense of humor. And Bill, I knew Bill, I don't know Pete Wells except from speaking to him, but he's got a serious bully pulpit, being the writer for the New York Times.
Yeah.
And now Bill had Eater, which I think was very relevant and powerful in our business for people in the business. And now he replaced Jonathan Gold at the LA Times. So you have Pete and Bill, and then the Times is going to start reviewing restaurants in Los Angeles. I mean, these guys have all the power, theoretically, you know?
Yeah.
So that with that, that comes a lot of responsibility. And I think sometimes, I don't know whether it's their editors or it's because of the public and they need clicks or they want a following, but you know, to glorify certain types of food and to compare it against real cuisine, whether the public's eating it or not, is a little ridiculous to me.
It's kind of irresponsible. You hit the nail on the head. With power comes responsibility.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's this kind of a drunken power thing happening when it comes
Some
to
people, I don't think those two gentlemen I spoke of are drunk with power.
Yeah.
They're passionate people, but I do see some shift. You see a shift because, like, when barbecues and tacos become more important than serious cuisine,
Yeah.
that's a social change,
Okay.
right? Because people are discovering simple ethnic foods, you know, or because I mean, how many people know what Ethiopian food is, right?
Right.
But in the last 10 years, the world has embraced the taco like I've never seen anything in my entire life. Even to the point where people are like making their own masa, you know, but you can go to any city, you go to Denver, there's a warehouse, there's a guy has troughs of corn,
Yeah.
you know, in solution,
Yeah.
and they're making tortillas. Those guys make the same tortillas as the person who's doing it on Netflix, you know.
Yeah.
So it's all how you draw attention to yourself and how the public perceives you.
Is there an important delineation between like the food truck culture and what we are obsessed with these days? Because everything somehow is notable, and then you lose track of what actually is, and the fine dining. I mean, those two things, they don't necessarily overlap, but in your mind, what's the relationship, if any, between those two entities?
I think it's purely economic, to be honest with you.
Okay.
And then also, people are longing for a simpler life, and I think food is the expression of that.
Okay.
You know, and then it's more affordable too. You know, I mean, going out to a really good French restaurant or even a good steakhouse, for that matter, it's $200, $300 a person.
Yeah.
And it could be upwards of that, $1,000
Yeah.
a person, some places. So, I don't think that it's sustainable except for those really, really talented and those who already have an established foundation.
So you think fine dining culture is, you know, mutating? You know, it's something. It's not what it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be about linen on the tables and crystal and, you know, 90 weight silver and a whole process. And then also with the critics related to that, you couldn't get a 4-star review in the New York Times unless you had all of that first.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
So there was a path led by the critic or by the business that in order to get a Michelin star or a 3 or a 4-star review in your city from the big paper, that you could follow, a path that you could follow. There's no longer any paths because certain critics over the last 25 years have wanted to make themselves famous, and just willy-nilly they've moved around from cuisine to chef and anointed people in their own subjective opinion.
The conclusion of this interview can be found in the next podcast, already available for your download. Thanks again for tuning in to the official podcast of PalateXposure, featuring Ilona Thompson.